Hello everyone, this is the Foil Guy here, and I'd like to welcome you all to another one of our how-to sculpting videos where I'm going to demonstrate step by step how to sculpt some of the figures that you would like to know how to do on your own and in more detail. Obviously, it's one thing to watch me doing these things, it's another thing for you to have the chance to see how they're done. So walking you through the step by step, of course, I take for granted that I've had almost 18 plus years of practice in this, so don't feel bad if it doesn't come across naturally. I have a lot of muscle memory in where my fingers need to go in order for this to work. But I'm going to walk you through step by step the basics on how to sculpt Darth Vader in honor of Star Wars Theory's Darth Vader fan film. We're going to be, of course, sculpting the Dark Lord of the Sith from Star Wars. Not all of you may know Alucard from Mobile Legends, but today we're going to be doing the most famous character in Star Wars, second of course to name your favorite Star Wars character here. So starting of course with the Dark Lord of the Sith, before we get into any details as far as the helmet or the lightsaber, or the cape, all these details, I'd like to first leave you with the basics, and we will take the time to do this with every video until they start to stick. So I'd like you, with your roll of aluminum foil, right here I have a nice Costco grade Reynolds product, and this actually tends to hold more weight than most because of its density, but if you buy dollar store bought aluminum foil, that's perfectly fine as well. Just tear across about a foot long of aluminum foil and tear it into 3 sections. Now aluminum foil is a very forgiving medium, so if you tear some pieces off larger than others, this is just for practice, don't worry about it. Mark with your finger where you're going to tear it in 3 equidistant areas, and then just tear across along those lines. It will be just as if you had folded them across a line of paper. And you notice that's all that I did. I put both of my hands on the foil and using my body weight tore them apart, and it fell fairly straight, at least straight enough for our purposes here today. Starting, of course, with aluminum foil sculpting, we want this to be a 3D image, so I want you guys to make sure that you know not only how to handle foil, but know that the focus isn't just molding, but knowing where and when to apply the right amount of pressure. In making a sculpture, we first need to recognize this is a 3D shape, not a 2D shape. It needs to be thick, not flat. So, if I want this piece of foil, this 2D shape, to look 3D, I am going to have to use molding. This is our first technique. But if I'm going to get this technique right, I want to make sure that I don't crush it flat. So following along with me, look at my hand. I am going to, instead of crushing it flat, mold it, but know where to stop. So molding this line, notice that my fingers and thumb are meeting, but not closing. I am going to simply mold this shape through the aluminum foil so that it looks no longer like a piece of paper, but a tube. And this will be the technique that we will be using to make 3D shapes. Now, this, of course, isn't all that we need to be doing when sculpting aluminum foil. We want this to be more than just a body. We want it to have details. And so the key in this endeavor in sculpting is going to be in not just molding, but pinching, working on minor details, and you'll notice that there will be a combination of these as we go on in sculpting Darth Vader. So making your foil as flat as possible, I want you to follow along with me in your pointer, middle, and thumb fingers and pinch in a line. Now note, I'm just putting my fingers down on the piece of foil and pinching them together, and thus there is a line with some depth into it. But then in 2 separate locations, I'm going to make another pinch meeting at a corner, and another pinch meeting at a corner. And what do you know? We have molded into the flat piece of foil a very short triangle. Now, the reflection on the light may make this difficult. Hopefully you can see that there now. But if I'm going to do any number of shapes, and you can just flatten this out and rework with it if you need the practice, but just being able and familiar enough with the material not to get intimidated and not to tear the material when you want it to look like a shape. Now, working these shapes into the foil is key, and not only bringing out the lesser details, but also molding in the bigger ones, because say I want a shape on a line, for instance Darth Vader's helmet, well, pinching in this from a square to say a hexagon is also going to involve pinching and molding. I flatten out this piece, and now we have a different shape. And pinching is all that needs to be done. I mold in the material, I pinch it to keep it in place. I'm using smaller fingers instead of my whole hand, and working out these kinds of shapes both in and out of the material. So moving on from there, reattaching. Obviously, you've seen me do these sculptures hopefully once or twice, and in doing these step by step, I also do them section by section. Well, tearing this piece in half, we'd wonder, how do we reattach this if we want to do this all by hand? No glue, no tape, no extra details or complications, no cleanup. Well, simply put, I just place them on top of each other and use the same techniques that we did before. Once again, two separate pieces. I'm going to place them on top of each other, pinch them together. Notice both are being included in this conjunction. And then molding. I'm flattening them out with my other fingers. And this will allow them to stay. Now, obviously, it's not a permanent fix. If I apply enough force, it will re-tear. But in molding and pinching, we're going to be using both of these techniques consistently throughout this project. So if you'd like to follow along with me, I'd like to walk you through step by step in the sculpture of Darth Vader in honor of Star Wars Theory's recent fan film. And we will be able to pay homage to the Dark Lord of the Sith. So, starting of course with his legs. He's a humanoid figure, so we can just start with a stick figure and then add on layers that will include more and more details in time. Waste not, want not. Let's use the pieces we already have. I'll mold this the same way that we did with the other leg. Cross this over, watch what I'm doing, cross this over, wrapping around the excess piece of foil and pinching it together, scrunching, if you will, this into a Y-like shape, and notice how it's going to be able to hold. Obviously, it's not going to be perfect. You'll see that while we're working with this, pieces may fall off here and there. But fortunately, foil, as was said before, is a very forgiving medium. You can work with this and rework with this without basically wasting too much material. So continuing with this, obviously 2 legs, he also needs 2 arms and a head. So let's tear off another piece. The size doesn't matter, just as long as you know exactly what's going to be done with it. Watch what I'm going to do here. I'm going to tear off a section, but not all the way. Straight down the middle, but I'm going to leave room in my mind for where the head's going to be. You can see with the backdrop of the cloth that I didn't tear this completely in half, just enough so that I could mold 2 separate arms. Now, I'm going to leave this all alone. This is going to be my head, but these are going to be my arms. And I, for now, just need 2 shorter legs, essentially, for those arms. Now, I'm going to attach this by making a mental note as far as how much support I want on the foil figure, laying this on top, like the slab at the end of episode 3. And notice, I'm just using these 2 fingers and my thumbs for support. I'm going to push in all the way, almost to the point where it's flat. Pinch once again down at the base of the neck, and now not only are the arms going to stick, but is that going to be hard to mold into a head? Well, absolutely not. I just basically have to, instead of a cylinder, I have to do an oval. So I'll take all of this into my hands, make sure that you guys can see me envelop it. And instead of crushing it, I'm just going to apply my fingers, thumbs, and the insides, basically, of my hand. Make sure there's some definition and difference between the neck and the head, but just making an oval. We'll work on the nose, eyes, and other details in a moment. But noting that, we have a stick figure, so congratulations, you passed Foil 101. But this certainly isn't enough to be considered Darth Vader, at least not by the criticism of the internet. So let's get started with the basics before we get into the complex. Let's move on to his pants and his boots. Just like what we did with the arms and the head, let's tear off another piece that will essentially be able to, yeah, that's plenty, envelop his legs and also give us enough room to add details to his boots. Notice I'm being very careful how far I tear so that we have essentially a flat pair of pants. Now, obviously this is going to be Darth Vader's, so if we're going to make this work, his suit was very thick, so we don't have to do too much in the realm of muscle tone. actually no muscles, they're robotic, but we do want them to look like legs. So what I'm going to do is, instead of just laying them on top of them and saying, I guess he just had a bad day on the street that day, I'm going to use my fingers. Now notice, keeping this kind of position with my hands, I'm just going to get the shape in mind of where the legs start and the foil begins, and then wrap around. Now notice what I did with my thumb. Well, while I was keeping the legs in place, and make sure that you can see this, I'm just wrapping this around in the same way that I did with the molding. Now, you understand that's what was done, and hopefully you don't have to see every detail in HD perfection. But you will be able to see, regardless of your resolution, that I left some foil unused, and that's because I want that to be the boot. Now the boot, I'm doing this all by memory, so you'll forgive me if the details aren't precise, but I also recall there may have been a knee pad on there as well. It's meant to be some intimidating suit of armor. So what I'm going to do, and this needs to be seen very close at hand, so what I'm going to do is, just with my finger and my thumb, I'm going to bend this up. Notice, just bending this up. The foil will cooperate with you, it's not sentient. And just like I did with the legs, I'm going to leave this room alone. I want there to be a distinction between his boot and his pants. So just pinching in the shin, I'm also going to leave some room at the bottom for his foot, because at least with my human comparison, there is a difference. Now, with this, it's pretty easy. I'll just pinch in a square on both sides until it looks the way that I want it to. And that looks a little pointy, kind of like an elf. That's not Darth Vader, so I'll use my thumb to press that portion in. If you need smoothing out, it's not going to be too difficult. Just enough practice and familiarity with the material will build up over time. But you can see there that we have a foot. Now the knee pad, just like I showed you with the pinching, I'm going to take the edges and pinch and mold them into the sort of square-like direction that I want them to, so that even if it can't be seen on screen, you will be able to tell in person. Nope, that's not going to come up good on through the screen, but you see the little rivet there. I'm making this into a piece of armor. And the same thing for the other side. I'm going to mold around, but leave room for the boot. Just make sure that his foot has some form of shape. Mold this over, just literally a folding over of the material, pinching around the shin but not the foot or the knee, because I want those to be different. Otherwise I would just make this all into one leg. I'm going to scrunch, I'm going to make this into a little square, pinching and molding in different directions until it looks the way that I want it to, and then molding this down and pinching on the sides, we have a pair of knee pads. So those will be Darth Vader's shoes. Now, going up from the waist up, we also remember that there was a piece of armor around his midriff, sort of a cod piece, if you will. Now this is actually interesting because for anyone who knows clothing material and how complicated that sometimes can be, this would also be handy if there would have been a belt as opposed to sewing something in if we're going to be making a sculpture. Fortunately, foil is all the same color. We can color it in post. Fortunately, he was all black. But I want you guys to keep in mind this extra long length that is going to be fully capable of wrapping around his waist. Maybe you see where I'm going with this. What I'm going to do is just make a makeshift belt that's going to blend in with his waistline. We'll add on his actual belt here in a moment. But molding around the lines of what I recall his midriff looking like. If you have a picture on hand, you can keep it a little bit more closely. But I'm just going to keep it in sort of a, that form and shape. I'm going to pinch in the sides. Obviously not to fully encompass his body, but enough to cover the area that I believe that piece of armor was. And you see I'm rolling over, I'm molding, I'm just feeling it along until I have the shape that I want. Pinching along the sides until it comes to a point, and of course pushing down the sides if I think that it's too long. And this will be something that is not only placed where I want it to, but wrapped around. Now how am I going to reattach this? Well, I'll just keep rolling over until it meets at a certain point. And then just like before, and I'll bring this closer so you can see, rolling it over, just like with a belt, I'm going to pinch it into place and press down. And you keep folding over and readjusting, and it's going to come out just fine. So with that, now we will move on to his computer. We want to make full use of this, but of course, if we're going to look at Darth Vader's frame, probably should be a little thicker than that. Now the good news is if you put layers on foil sculptures, they're going to become stronger. So I'm just going to fold this over each other so that we've got 4 layers instead of 2. Place them on top of each other and then just simply wrap them around his base. And that's all that really need be done. Maybe perhaps some adjusting to make sure there aren't any pieces hanging out. But we're going to keep wrapping and wrapping and wrapping to add more and more and more details as we go. Now, just like we did with his lower body armor piece, we'll make another belt for him, just a nice long piece. And of course the computer, which is going to be wrapped around him as well. Tear that piece off and then just simply make a square. But we want it to also have a belt so that we can attach it without too much drama or extra pieces. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to section off that mentally for myself. And visibly, as you can see, I'll make a little candy wrapper by pinching all of these to the point where they're almost flat. You can see that there I did some very dramatic adjustments, but this is what's going to be our computer. And we just have to mold that, pinch it into a square. And that's going to be all that needs to be seen for the details. And if you want to add in other details later on, give it a little more depth and thickness, as you can see, that's certainly enough to service the point. But if you want to add in layers, just keep wrapping around it, but without compromising the edges that you pushed into it. Just fold over on those defined lines, and that's all that need be done. So we have Darth Vader's computer. Now, other than regulating his breathing, obviously that's the first thing that we want to go on. That's going to be on his midsection here, and as the piece gets a little out of alignment, we can just keep adjusting it. And as you can see here on the bottom, I'm just going to mold the pieces into each other, and what do you know? It sticks. Now, the belt, obviously same principle, just at a very much smaller scale, very much more smaller scale, I suppose is the grammatical way to do it. Just keep molding in those shapes. 2 or 3 squares will do just fine. I believe that there was other details, of course, but it's not going to, of course, be too much of an expectation to get the belt just right, just enough so that it looks like it should. And wrapping that around will work just fine. Other pieces are coming out of order. You just have to bow tie them and push them back into place. So that will be Darth Vader's midsection. But as I recall as well, Darth Vader also had a lower body cape as opposed to the one that was hanging over his shoulders. Now, if you have picture support for this or not, you can do what you will. But I'm going to add in those details as they come to mind because I want this to look good. But of course, if it's a lower body cape, not a full body cape, I'm probably not going to need as much as I would the main cape. So tearing off a smaller piece, I'll make a little visual adjustment and say, yeah, that's probably ankle length. I'll settle for that. And capes are really easy because they're just flowing cloth. All I have to do is make sure that this sticks to this and isn't spread out like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take each piece and mold them into his waist. Now, if you would like to use the belt as an adjustment for this, just like in real life, you can wait to attach the belt afterwards as another method of layering. But notice as well that as I'm pushing this stuff in and molding it into the sides of his legs, sometimes the legs will get readjusted. You just have to move them back down again. But this doesn't look quite right. There's 2 things you can do. You could either tear it off and make it the right length, or you can just mold in. Note, I'm stretching it taut and then molding and rolling it into itself so that it's going to be able to hold the kind of shape that I want it to, something hanging off of the sides. Now obviously this looks a little blocky. We could do a little better than that for Darth Vader. So if you want to work with motion, just like we did with the sides, pulling it taut, you can also do that in separate areas along the insides as well. Now notice I took it off in doing so, but it's easy to reattach. I haven't broken anything. We're still making it. But that's all that's really needed. And again, if it ends up folding over too much, then you can just spread it out again. But that's the basic point. That's the idea. The light reflection may make it difficult to see, but you can tell our legs haven't gone anywhere. You just simply have to get the details that you want to be seen. So with that in mind, I'll make a few more adjustments and we'll move on to his shoulder guards. Now his shoulder guard is going to cover a lot of detail, and of course if we don't have to do obviously the pectorals, or he's not a female form, then this is going to take care of more than one thing. The shoulders, obviously, it's going to come around, I believe, at about that length. So we will make accommodations as such. Just keep in mind that we want this to be a thicker portion of his body, so maybe folding it over, but not all the way. Notice the excess area that we have left over. Pinching into a curvature, so that's going to hang over his shoulders, and doing little visual readjustments in case it's too wide or too short, we will have this shape. Now, as I recall as well, this is from memory, so forgive me if there's any errors, but there were lines that went down it as well. Well, this is an easy fix. We just pinch in those minor details, and hopefully you can see that on the camera. Don't believe you can, but nonetheless, I'll make them more dramatic and then fix them so that you can tell exactly what I'm doing. Noting that point. Looks like a little waffle, but spreading that out, how are we going to get this attached to his body? Well, just like we did with his pants and with his arms, I will tear out a piece from the top, the parts that I didn't mold with, but not so far as it messes up what I've already worked on, so that in the end, it's going to look like this. And then with minor adjustments, obviously we want to roll and wrap this around into more of a U-like shape so it actually matches the direction and shape that the breastplate was meant to look like. And with this in mind, we will have what Darth Vader's front armor was supposed to look like. And these, of course, will be draped over his shoulders and play a role momentarily in our cape. But that will be his upper body. Now, what about his arms? Before we get into his cape, let's focus on these. Well, just like with the legs, he doesn't have much muscle because he's machined, but he has hands, which is going to make this difficult. Now, I can show you how to do fingers. I'll do a little brief tutorial right here. We have a small little sheet of foil. I'll just tear in 5 separate appendages, a thumb obviously below the top 4, and then rolling them into very small details. You can see where the principle comes from. But instead of doing that today, we're going to have both of his hands gripping his lightsaber for the sake of simplicity. So I'll just roll this over and that'll be the handle. How's that? I'll make that into a little cone and you can follow along with me there. Obviously, this sculpture that we're going to make here today is going to be in several future photos that will be taken involving the Darth Vader fan films fan content, the concept art that'll be used in his duel against Mace Windu in the episodes of the fan film that we hope will be coming soon. And again, Star Wars Theory, we thank you for your contributions to the fan base. We're very sorry to hear about what Disney has done. But nonetheless, with all that being said, the Darth Vader frame, and noting that he doesn't have too much muscle, but it is bulky, we'll tear this in half and then leave room for little crab-like claws to wrap around the lightsaber at a later time. If you'd like to add in fingers and then just wrap it around, it's going to look the same either way. But noting that, just like what we did with the legs, wrap that around, and oh my, that still looks a little skinny now, doesn't it? And that also leaves a lot of room at the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tear this into a 2/3 proportion. Make sure I don't tear it off, obviously. With that giant hand, I'll wrap another layer around so that it looks bigger. And obviously I want to stop at the shoulder length. That is the goal in all of this. So with that stated in mind, this will be used to wrap around and be provided as his grip, and I'll do the same thing to the other side. I'll wrap this around, still not as thick as I would like, so I'll tear this in half, but not all the way. Wrap it around and continue working from there. Now, if you want to make sure that there's a fine line between the distance of his arms and his shoulders, you can make that mark mentally or physically on the arms so that you know where his hands are supposed to be and you don't forget later on. But of course, we're going to be adjusting and readjusting plenty of times through this process. It's not going to be that big of a deal. Now for the cape. Before we move on to the really hard part of the helmet, let's do the cape. Same principle that we did with the lower body flawed, but we want this to go all the way over his body. Now, you also could probably tell these two areas hanging over his shoulders are not molded in. Well, these are going to be what will grip on to the cape itself. Before I do that, I want to make sure that I have the right shape. So at a very, very modest angle, we'll make sure that the cape actually looks flowy instead of flat, and I'll pinch in the sides into somewhat of a triangle. And also, I'll pull taut the areas that I want to have that sort of waving motion. And interestingly enough, with enough practice, we found that this has that tendency to form that kind of shape. And then all I have to do now is find where the two little appendages over the shoulder blades were, wrap them around, and of course compensate if I pulled too far or too long in certain areas. I could either try again, I could use another piece, or I could simply remove the shoulder plate and make another one that fits the cape, or vice versa. Obviously, what we're going to be doing here doesn't have to be pretty, it just has to be explainable. So as you guys are practicing this, you'll be able to figure out what works for you. But with all of that said, noting the cape and the flow that is meant to be formed, I just moved this up after I got the shape in advance. Now for the helmet. Well, the helmet's going to be tricky because that includes a lot of minor details. And obviously, Darth Vader also has a body underneath it, so maybe I'll give him a slight pinch in the middle of his face for a nose. And interestingly enough, when I made that pinch, the eyes almost seemed to form. Maybe I can use my thumbs to indent on them a little bit, move my finger below his nose to give him a little bridge, minor adjustments here and there. But we're not going to see much of his face, so not much effort needs to be made. What I do need to note, however, is where the chin starts and where the eyebrow starts. Everything else is going to basically flow from there. So as I recall, based off of there's no way of getting around it, the German World War II Nazi helmets that were based around that type of frame, he had that covering around his ears. So we'll take that just like in episode 6 in 2 separate pieces. And with the piece that I think is going to be less substantial, we can, from there, start to make the mask. Now the mask, obviously, I want to wrap that around his neck so that it stays in place. You got a good idea of where his head is? Well, just like with episode 3, you're not going to see that again. At least not for a while. And mold this around his neck so that it has the ability to stay on in its shape. The triangle that was made at the bottom of his jaw is going to be pinched in, and we remember the 2 pronged points as well. What I want you to do with this, and I'll demonstrate on a separate piece of foil, is to pinch and twist around, just like what you're seeing me do here, so that it comes out at a sharp point. I'll demonstrate this again with the lightsaber, but that's literally all that you need to do. Watch what I'm doing. I pinch it almost flat and then just twist my fingers, roll it around in my hand so that it looks like it's coming out at a point. Well, paying very careful attention to where my hands are, I'll take out a piece from the back, mold it over to the front, and pinch it so that it looks like it's coming at a point. And then the excess can just be molded into the triangle shape it's about to be. Same thing for the other side. I'll just twist it into a point so it looks the way that I want it to be. The 2 flat ends meeting at this point will then have to come up to a tip. So let's bring that up, and now we have what's starting to look like his mouth. Let me bring it closer to the camera so that you can see. Now, you notice that dramatic shapes, just like what we would imagine Darth Vader's mask to look like. His nose bridge will just be a simple push down if you got the shape pointed right, and then if there's any excess, then you just pinch it in and push down once again. The eyes will solve themselves, but the rest is going to be in his eyebrows. I'm going to take the excess and roll it into somewhat of a burrito and push it over the back. I'll crush the frame in between my primary fingers until it looks like the back of a human skull. And then I'll just use my fingers as a guide for where the eyebrow is going to be. Obviously, he's meant to be intimidating and angry, so I'll pinch and push where needed. And that will be the basics of his helmet. Now for the actual helmet of the helmet, as opposed to his mask, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, just like with the cape, first get an idea, leave this as an excess. This will be used to attach it later on. But this is going to be something that wraps all the way around his head. So I'm going to fold it in sections and places where I get a basic idea of, just like with the cape, the idea of the shape. Press in the lines to make them more dramatic and start to curve them. Let me make sure that you can see this. Start to curve them upward in the way that I mold it. Can everyone see that? So as I'm doing this, it's starting to take the shape that I want it to. Then I do the same thing on these sides until it's going to meet at the point that I want it to at the head. Now this essentially is going to be all that I need, but this obviously doesn't look like Darth Vader from the top. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place the top of the helmet at the place that I want it to, and then push forward onto his eyebrows exactly where I want it to meet. Now since Darth Vader's, the top of his head rather, was a little bit more pronounced from what I remember, rolling it upward won't require too much adjustment, and I'll just fold this over the back to hide the excess details. You can see the work with my thumb made short work of that. Now, little adjustments here and there, of course, are going to be a continual part of this process, and becoming familiar with the material is always key. But the more you practice, the more this will become familiar to you, and in time, you'll find that this stuff is going to come naturally, quickly, and even, dare I say, something that you could perhaps start making foil sculptures of. And I have no problem with that whatsoever. You can tell we've got the basic concept of a Darth Vader style helmet. Now this, of course, is for tutorial purposes. We want to do something a little bit more pronounced and complicated. We could perhaps add another layer to give him more of an angry look. Wrap that around. Pronounced for his eyebrows. All of these things that are going to be needed to impress a more harsh critic. But this is your guys' first time. Don't be afraid or ashamed if it doesn't come out exactly the way that you want it to. All we need is the basics for you guys to know where you're headed. And you can tell we're starting to get there. Now for the lightsaber. Well, we have the handle, but what about the blade? Well, the blade's going to be fairly simple. Just, once again, roll like we saw before this into a shape that's going to resemble a blade. And as you can see, I'm just twist tying it, basically. Rolling with my fingers into this kind of shape so that it looks like a lightsaber blade. Wrap this around and down to, of course, support the weight of the handle and hilt. And if you want further details added to the lightsaber that he stole from that Jedi Master, you can add little pieces here and there if you want them to stand out, but it's not necessary because his hands are going to be enveloping most of it. And I'll do the same principle. I'll choose which hand is going to be below and above, wrap them around, but make sure that there is a definite difference between his wrist and his hand. I can compare myself for references, I suppose. And likewise, the same underneath as above. Wrapping that around his wrist, but making sure there's a distinction. Now we have Darth Vader holding his lightsaber. Now, whether that's a little stiff or you want him to bend at the elbows, that's all that need be done. But that would be Darth Vader. So, if any of you have any questions, would like further clarification, or have other requests, Star Wars themed or not, you all let me know in the comments. Thank you for taking the time, and be sure to support Star Wars Theory, not just in his Vader fan film, but his content that he provides for the fan base every day. See you guys next time.